this discussion earlier on where we tried to develop some understanding of why we behave in the way we do. We tried to understand our reasoning, our thought process, and we figured out that our actions are in fact a result of the way our brain is wired to think. This, we figured out, was largely due to our culture and traditions and customs and social behaviors, but we all concluded in our discussion that it came down to the way our brain thinks in certain circumstances. From here on, we figured out that it is down to behavioral sciences, it is down to the neuroscience to understand how this thought process or these behaviors come into play. We defined neuroscience as the study of the nervous system, and we looked into different parts of the nervous system. We figured out there is a central nervous system and then there's a peripheral nervous system. We looked into their structures in detail, and now we steer our conversation to a very basic building block of the nervous system, which is the neuron itself. So we're now going to look into the structure of the neuron and understand how it functions. Okay, so this is the structure of the neuron in general. Different neurons have different kinds of structure, and that is dependent on their functionality. But all neurons share some similar attributes which we are interested in, so let's have a look at that. But before we get down to the individual elements, I just want to lay it out here that there is some intuition in the way this is structured, and I hope we can develop this intuition together. You see on your left hand side there is a branch-like, tree-like, thread-like structure right here, and then there's a channel or a branch or protrusion, if you will, moving out from this larger structure, and then there are small branches that are off there. So the intuition I'm referring to is about the directionality of information transfer. Remember, this is a neuron. We're talking about generation, creation, and then transfer of information or impulse or electrical activity, whatever you want to call it. But there is a flow of information that's taking place, and a flow of signals that's taking place. So if you look at it, there's a cell body right here, and then there is some channel through which the information is going to flow outwards from the cell body, and then it's going to dissipate or move into other cells. So you can identify a communication channel when you look at the structure of a neural cell right away, at least this one. Now let's look at the individual elements. As said earlier, you have these thread-like, branch-like structures, tree-like structures called dendrites. Their core functionality is to receive information from the outside world, okay, from other neurons perhaps, and to receive that information, and then that information is then passed on to the cell body, the main cell body. The main cell body is also called the soma, which contains the nucleus and your ribosomes, mitochondria, and other organelles, filaments that are pretty much conventional to any other cell. So you have this main cell body, and that information then moves out from the main cell body to the axon. Okay, so that information is then passed through the axon. Axon is carrying that information, that electrical impulse, that signal is carried by the axon, and then it's transferred to other neuronal cells by the axon terminals. Okay, so notice the axon is covered by this thing called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is essentially a lipid, a lipoprotein, and it's a glue-like structure. It's meant for the protection of the axon, so that the electrical signal is well insulated. There's no leaking of the electrical signal. The idea is to provide a protective coating over this axon. And this glue-like structure, this glue-like fat lipid in nature structure, is in fact not a direct part of the neuron itself, Rather, this is provided, this is made by the glial cells in the nervous system. So the glial cells, glial is a Greek word essentially meaning glue, and that is what it is. It is a glue-like structure. It glues to the axons and provides a protective coating. So these glial cells in the peripheral nervous system, this is provided by the Schwann cells. Okay, in the central nervous system, this is provided by the oligodendrocytes. All right, so these two different cells, depending on the central or the peripheral nervous system, they provide the myelin sheath over the neurons. They are unmyelinated neurons as well, which do not have this sheath. Both kinds exist. However, the fundamental need of this sheath is to make sure that there is the electrical signal is well insulated. However, you see that in this sheath there is some breakage right here. There are certain parts that are not covered by this sheath, and those are called the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so these are unmyelinated parts of the myelin sheath of the axon, and this is and during these when the signal is traveling through the axon, the unmyelinated part is basically allowing the electrical signal to get recharged, okay, through the voltage gated sodium ions. They facilitate the electrical signal to get recharged as it moves along the axon. Okay, so it's not that the signal is leaking, rather it is recharging in these points. So that is pretty much the structure of the neuron, and now we look into different types of neurons. Okay, so we broadly categorize them into sensory neurons, the motor neurons, the interneurons. Okay, so those are the three types of neurons that we categorize neurons in. The sensory neurons are meant to receive external stimuli. Their inputs, the information that they receive in their dendrites, is largely from the external environment, the taste, smell, vision, feel, touch. So those are the that is the external stimuli that's activating these sensory neurons. Okay, and then that information is relayed on to the body, to the brain and spinal cord for some decision making. The motor neuron that you see right here, the motor neuron is functioning as something that is then connecting to the final skeletal muscles, for instance, where the final effect, the final action that's going to take place is through these motor neurons. These are the neurons that are basically making the final end result or the end action that's coming into place. So that's due to these motor neurons. The connection between these two is through the interneurons. Okay, so the interneurons, they act as a middleman between these two, connecting these two together. And this is just an illustration. It's not necessary that there's only one sensory and one inter and one motor neuron forming a neural network. So there are multiple of these that are set up. And sometimes these interneurons, they can also save time by sending messages to the spinal cord, and then instead of sending the message all the way to the brain, these could just send messages to the spinal cord and back, and make a relevant decision on their own. So basically they have a decision making autonomy, if you will. They have a decision making autonomy on their own, where they can make the decision and relay that decision back to the motor neurons for the muscles to act accordingly. Okay, so those are the three different types of neurons: the sensory, motor, and the interneurons. Now let's look at the different structures within these neurons. You'd notice, by the way, that the sensory neuron has a different shape from the inter and the motor neurons. It looks like there's a branch coming off from the cell body, and then it's going on to different to one end moves to the dendrites, the other to the axons. Rather, there's only one branch present in the sensory neuron from its cell body. Whereas when you look at the interneuron or the motor neuron, there are multiple branches moving out from the main cell body. Okay, and I will try to explain it over here in this slide. Yes, so there are four categories of the neuron itself that we talk about, and these are the unipolar neurons, which are these, and these are typically the sensory neurons, because the idea is to receive information and then pass it on. How does this work? Why do we call it a unipolar, whereas this is a bipolar neuron? And it's due to the branching from the main cell body. So there's only one branch. There are two branches that are moving on from the cell body, and then you can guess it that this is a multipolar neuron. There are multiple branches moving off from the main cell body, and then this fourth that you see on your bottom right is in fact a pseudo-unipolar neuron, where although there is one branch from the main body, but then it further branches out into two. Okay, so it's similar to a bipolar, but slightly different from it. Okay, so hence the name pseudo-unipolar neuron. So that being said, we're going to conclude our discussion with leaving you with the picture of the neuron here, where you see different elements of the neuron. You have dendrites on one end, which are basically the inputs to the neuron. There is some decision making that's happening in the neuron or relaying of information, whether the electrical signal has to be passed on or not. All of that is happening here in the cell body, and if the signal has to be passed on, there is electrical signal that goes on from the axon. It's carried by the axons and then passed on from the axon terminals through a synapse. So we'll discuss more on this in the future talks. Thank you so much.